After that introduction, the first thing I need to do is correct it. I told him when he said, what should I mention in your introduction tomorrow? And I said, make something up because that way it's more interesting for both of us. First of all, I would like to say he has the rainfall wrong. Our average rainfall is actually 13 inches. So we love when we get 19 inches. We think it's a great year. The lowest that I've seen since I started farming was in 22. We had 6 inches, and that is actually precipitation. That's not just rainfall. So we know how to farm when it's dry. And so when I come to events like this, and there's guys that are sitting out there that's like, you get 3 times the moisture you get in a year. Why should I listen? It's like, I don't want you to listen to me to copy what I'm doing, because I honestly believe every farm is different and the land knows the farmer that farms it. And if you make drastic changes, that land doesn't respond because it's like, that's not you. But I want you to listen to the ideas that I have and what I'm thinking about and think, how can that apply to you, or where are your goals and where you want to move to? So, so today I'm going to, do a little introduction. I'm going to talk about what the biggest thing that we have going on the farm right now, which is dealing with row spacing and plant population. I think some of you will find this actually quite interesting. Then I'm going to talk about other people's mistakes, because I seem to collect neighbors that don't know their own legal addresses. And so they end up having custom cutters and custom applicators doing things on our farm, and then we get to learn from it. And then kind of talk about some of the new things that we're looking at this coming years. And then we'll have a little bit of time for contact info and questions. So, challenging the status quo takes commitment, courage, imagination, and above all, a dedication to learning. And so what you do when you come to events like this is you are challenging that status quo. You are challenging that this is the way that it's always been done. And I'm really lucky because I work with my parents, and my father struggled with his father-in-law controlling what he was always doing for 40 years. So when I came back to the farm in 2017, my dad said, I know what it feels like if you want to innovate and somebody tells you no. So his basic rules to me was you have to have a market, and you have to show that it has a possibility of profitability. So it's one of those, you don't even have to be profitable, you have to show that you have a chance of being profitable. And when it started, I knew it was difficult. I could see that the first year, it's like, we're gonna raise field peas. And he's like, we know nothing about field peas. Now, I came home from a conference a couple years ago, he goes, what's the crazy thing we're gonna do now? I said, we're gonna raise rice. And he goes, okay, where's your market? So I know things have changed, and I'm blessed because I'm working with someone that understands that we need to challenge what we're doing, because we are farming in an environment that is changing, both politically, what's available in terms of what we can use for herbicides, things like that, and environmentally, we're seeing things get a little bit drier, a little bit hotter every year. And we're also seeing some really weird patterns. Our August is now April. August was 70 degrees and wet the whole month. April was nice and dry and hot. So we see these really drastic changes happening. The other thing is we need to challenge our own status quo before someone else does. So we need to ask these questions to ourselves of what can we do in our operation before we get challenged on that from an outside source. And usually that outside source involves either a lender or a landlord. So we need to understand why we're making the choices that we're making and be able to challenge that and think through that so we can communicate that in the future. So when we come to these events and we see these ideas and it's like, oh, I want to go try that, make sure you really understand why you want to try that. Not because it's a cool new toy or it's an interesting idea, but what does it do for your operation and how does it move you closer to your goals on what you want to be doing with your land and what your expectations are for your land and for your operation. The other thing that I always like to talk about is the mental challenges. I mean, farming is a very intense profession. There's a lot of stresses out there. I use this picture, I took it off the internet, and sometimes I wish, I would hope that the person who buried their combine was in the room, because that way I know they actually got it dug out. But at the same time, I don't want them to be there because it's a little embarrassing. If you look what they have for equipment here, they have a track hoe, they have a mini hoe, they have a telehandler, and the best part is they have a header trailer. And there's nothing on that header trailer at the moment, which tells you that header is on the front of that combine. Somebody had a really long harvest and dealt with a lot of mental stress. So when it comes to what you do on your operation, there's two different areas that stressors come from. One of them's internal, that what if. That what if of, well, I harvested a pretty decent crop and I cut my nitrogen applications by 40%. What if? What if I would have been that much bigger of a crop? What if I would have done this? What if I'd have done that? And we can't live in the world of what ifs because that is living in the past. So we have to look at what we did, learn our lessons, and move forward. Because if we get stuck in that trap, then it stops us from making other decisions and moving forwards. The other one is the one that's never talked about, and it really hangs over our heads, is the pressure to maintain that operation, or more importantly, to grow that operation. Boy, you took it over and you were, 1,000 acres, but why aren't you 1,500 acres now? And there is that piece, and people talk about, what is tradition? Tradition is peer pressure from dead people. Think about that a little bit. But we need to be aware that hangs over our head every day. My family has been farming in Colorado for 140 years. Before that, they were farming in Iowa. They left Iowa because they thought, this is way too easy. We need to move somewhere where it's a challenge. So if I make mistakes and I lose the farm, I have lost what my family has been working on for 140 years. That's significant. Because it's one thing if I started something and I lose it, because that's just me. But to look at, we have this heritage hanging over us, which is a wonderful thing. But at the same time, we need to recognize it for what it is and understand that when we look at that, we can occasionally have that conversation with my grandfather that's no longer around of what would he think of what we're doing? And would he approve of it? And if he wouldn't approve of it, what would I have to explain to him so he could understand? So sometimes we need to look at what's going on and look at these changes and understand that there's a lot of weight pressing against us. Now then there's the other side. The other side is external. It's the community. Sometimes it's your own family members of, well, this is not how we do this. I'm drilling corn. I use an air seeder to seed my corn on 12-inch spacing. I'm sorry, that's not how we raise corn. Well, just because that's not how we used to do it, does that make it right? Does it always right? Are there things that we learn that make it that we maybe should try something different? Flat out told that won't work. Rice in Northeast Colorado, that won't work. So far, they're right. I've got 2 years in. I got 1 more year to go. I give myself 3 years with any crop because I got to learn how to raise that crop first. The first year, it died in the middle of July. Last year, it didn't head out, but I kept it live for the entire season. The problem is my seasons are too short compared to where they usually raise rice, so I'm going to actually have to raise it earlier. So I have to give myself that opportunity, but just because it hasn't been done doesn't mean it doesn't work. And we have to give it that chance, and we have to recognize that everybody's going to make their own decisions and have their own metric for what's success and what's not. And then the other thing is our climate doesn't do that. I hear people, well, it's too dry to do this, or it's too wet to do this. I don't raise cover crops. I believe that my climate's too dry to do cover crops. I have a neighbor that does cover crops. He runs cattle over them, he grazes them. I say, well, that's not a cover crop, that's forage. But that's his choices, and he knows what that does for his soils. I look and I raised this last year, I had 12 different crops on 2,000 dryland acres. And when I say dryland, that literally means no irrigation. So no irrigation questions for me. But it's one of those, that's what works for me. And these things do work for me. 12-inch row spacing on corn works for me. It works great on sunflowers and milo. And where we're headed in the future, we'll talk about later, but we're talking about narrow row spacing on everything. So once we identify these challenges and recognize these challenges exist, we can kind of keep that in the back of our mind. When we have that day, it's like, oh man, this has just been absolutely a miserable year. We can look back and go, where are we in terms of our goals? And are we making progress even if you only have 6 inches of precipitation? Because we can still make things change. We can improve our soils when we do those sort of things. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is the row spacing. When I came back to the farm in 2017, came back to the farm the second time, I came back in 1999, and the land that I had leased got sold from out from underneath me, and so I went off and did a lot of different things. I taught for a bit. I went and got a degree in culinary arts. I worked at an accounting office. Believe it or not, it's the degree in culinary arts that has been the most profitable for me so far. But when I came back in 2017, the deal I made with my dad is I'll come back and farm, because he was going to sell out. He was 75 years old, and he was an old farmer, you know. Knees are shot, the back shot, his attitude is totally spent. And so I said, I'll come back as long as I can make the changes that I need to make, because I don't want to farm for 40 years like you did, and in the end of the 40 years, be exhausted and spent both physically, emotionally, and monetarily. He farmed for 40 years and essentially has gotten nowhere better than where he was. And so I didn't want to be in that situation. I said, I want to make these changes. And I said, I want to raise these different crops. And the first thing that I wanted to bring back, because he started planting sunflowers in 1975, and he planted sunflowers until 2008, and he will admit that was the biggest mistake he ever made in the history of his farm, is he stopped planting sunflowers. Because of what we've learned, sunflowers have a tremendous root system, and they're really good for cycling micronutrients that escape too deep to bring them back up. And I wanted to bring sunflowers back, but I didn't want to fix our planter. Our planter had been sitting for 10 years at that point. And it's like, I have to completely rebuild that thing. And I don't like planters as they are, because, I mean, they're just waiting to break down. I mean, they're nothing but a bunch of bearings that are looking for the opportunity to ruin your day, especially if there's a storm coming. And so I went to my dad and I was like, I'm going to drill it. And he goes, well, how are you going to harvest drilled sunflowers? And I said, well, we'll get a pan combine head, you know, pans, and we'll do it that way. And he goes, we're not buying a header until you show me that they'll grow. So that first year I went out there and I used the same seeding rate as I did when I was planting. And it worked. I had sunflower heads that were like this big around, which are way too big for oil sunflower heads. But I went against that we had to be on 30-inch rows. And people say that we have to be on 30-inch rows because that's the equipment we have. We have to be on 30-inch rows because in my environment, we're really dry and we can't have plants close together because they need as much moisture as they can get. And so we're set into, this is what equipment dealers sell us, so this is what must be right. And they neglect the real world that we live in. Colorado, Northeast Colorado, and Ted has just been waiting for this. Our pan evaporation rate is 72 inches. Ted always gives me crap about this. What pan evaporation rate is, the funny thing is they actually don't even measure it in Iowa because you have something called humidity. In Colorado, high humidity is like 50%. We're like, man, it's humid today. People come visit us and they're like, this climate is great. And it's like, well, wait until the middle of winter when your humidity, outside humidity is 10% or less. We evaporate moisture all the time. So what pan evaporation is if you had a pan of water sitting outside with an infinite amount of water in it and you measured how much that dropped over a season, we can evaporate 72 inches of water a year. We can evaporate 6 feet of water, and that's on average. Back in 22, when we had these 6 inches of precipitation, the pan evaporation rate for that year in Northeast Colorado was 126 inches. So yeah, we can evaporate water. We do it really well. And so that is my biggest challenge. How do I capture that water that we get, and how do I keep it in the ground? And that's what Dr. Hatfield was talking about yesterday, was what do we do to maintain that? What are those challenges and how do we address those? So in our part of the world, anything that doesn't have a canopy on it, a growing canopy, is evaporating moisture. So the faster I can close that canopy, the faster I start saving moisture, or I actually get work out of the moisture that I lose. The part of the world that I farm in, fallow cropping is very common. So they let the ground lay fallow either every other year or every third year. Some guys have gone to every 4 years. What research has shown is the crop that you raise is raised on the moisture you get in that year. That moisture that lands that I'm not going to go till that, so we were no-till fallow. And so we'd go out and we would spend $75 to $125 an acre to maintain a clean field. And then we would drill our wheat into it in the fall. What research has shown is the rain that falls on that field either evaporates or it percolates. It doesn't stay in that nice 3-4 foot band that we always believed that it did. So that's why we actually went to continuous cropping, so we could feed our soils all the time. But we recognize that in that wide row spacing, we evaporate moisture. So what I did is I've explained this to people and they looked at me like I was crazy, which doesn't necessarily mean much. But then I thought, diagrams are always better. So I spent some time, and you can see here where we have our row spacing on 30-inch rows. And so an acre is 6 rows wide and a half mile long. So if we do our calculation, we have a plant, or we hope to have a plant, every 13.5 inches. And note, I have a perfect planter. I have no doubles. At the time when I was planting, though, I didn't have auto steer, so my rows aren't straight. Now, I'm going out there with an air seeder on 12-inch spacing. So in that 12-inch spacing, I'm going to have 16 rows a half mile long. And that comes out to a plant every 39.5 inches of furrow length. So that first year I raised sunflowers, that the heads were enormous. Well, the reason is my plants were too far apart. I could walk across the rows and not touch a plant. It was pretty crazy. And so when I talk about this, and when we do this, we have equal spacing. So every plant has about 3 square feet of space. And the closest neighbor is 13.5 inches when it's planted, and it could be whatever when it's drilled. But if we let this crop grow, we increase, and you either can look at this in one of two ways. You either could look this as that increasing size is the above the ground plant mass, or how I prefer to look at it is that is actually the roots below the ground. So how much soil are we interacting with as that grows? Above ground, what kind of canopy, how fast are we covering the ground? And in Colorado, most years, you go out to harvest your dryland corn, and it's just like that. You can see down the rows. So I'm actually evaporating moisture out of the center of the row every day of the growing season. It also allows the sunshine to get in there, so that heats up my soils. So I have hotter, drier soils. But I get to use my planter. Where I'm out there with my air seeder, and if I'm seeding with the same population, I end up with these giant gaps. Like I said, you can walk across the field without touching plants. So that first year that I did it, it was successful, but we need to really examine what's going on when we look at plants growing. So I started doing the what if. What if we wanted uniform spacing of the plants inside the row? So what if I wanted to plant every 13.5 inches inside the row? And I did my math, and it's like, oh, we usually plant corn at 12 to 14,000 plants per acre. We seed sunflowers at 16,000 plants per acre when we plant them. The problem is, if I go out and I drill that same thing, I need to be at 37,000 plants per acre to have that same spacing between the plants. And what I end up doing is we end up with an equidistant grid. So for every foot between plants, it's foot between rows. And that equidistant spacing really helps tighten that up. And you can't walk across the rows so much. So, and what we came up with is this 2.67 times is the population, 8/3. And so I was looking at it, and it's like 8/3. Well, that's kind of interesting. So if we do uniform spacing, we end up with 6 on 30-inch rows is 3 miles of furrow per acre. If I'm out there with my 16, 12-inch rows, I'm at 8 miles of furrow per acre. So I have a lot more furrow out there in any given acre. Well, that ratio is 8/3. It's always great when you approach a problem from 2 different directions and get the exact same answer coming out. So that 8/3 is that ratio of furrow per acre for where you're at. And so that is one of those pieces that moving forward, as we change things, it's going to help me kind of judge where we need to go on our populations. So I do my same example, but I recognize that I have a lot more furrow in the ground, and I need to give that seed in that furrow for that opportunity. So as it starts to grow, we start to see canopy a whole lot faster. I figure we canopy minimum 3 weeks faster. If you look at this last example picture, it's the same on the left-hand side, but the right-hand side is completely covered. You can't see the rows during the growing season. That means that ground is covered, and we are actively affecting all of that soil. We don't have soil that is not being contacted by roots. And people are like, well, you're crowding your plants. Well, hold it. When you plant it, you're 13.5 inches between plants as it is. So how am I crowding it when we were giving the same distance to the neighbor is the same? What I'm doing here is I'm shading the soil, so I'm keeping my soil cooler. I'm reducing evaporation because it's cooler soil in the first place. It is also going to be, I'm developing that microclimate inside there. And then I gave this talk, and it was about a month later, I received an email from an NRCS employee out of Nebraska. And he said, I think you would find this article interesting. And it was an article talking about when you close that canopy, I've always focused on moisture. He goes, when you close that canopy, you trap carbon dioxide in that canopy. That soil, as long as it's a living soil, off-gasses CO2 during the whole growing season. If you close that canopy, you actually keep that carbon dioxide in that canopy, and you give your plants a better opportunity for growth. And I thought that was really interesting. I had never thought about that. I always figured our limiting factor is moisture, so I'm going to focus on the moisture. But some people, their limiting factor might not be moisture, but it might actually be CO2 levels or oxygen levels at that field, and how does that affect it? Now, one thing I will say about this is, in our environment, we have advantages over you guys. We don't have diseases. Well, we do, but it's a wet year, and we can deal with diseases in a wet year. We don't have the insect pressures. The most we have is grasshoppers, if we are maintaining a good system. Dr. Thomas Dijkstra is a great presenter talking about how Brix levels, the sugar levels in a plant, affect what insect can eat that plant or what insect will eat that plant. We have seen it on our farm. He also talks about diseases the same way. We try to keep our Brix levels above 12, and when we do that, the grasshoppers are the only thing that wants to come into our fields, and even then they'd rather eat on the neighbors. This last year we put in 140 acres of pollinator strips. We replaced all of our headlands with 90 feet of pollinators. And all the neighbors thought we were crazy. Of course, they didn't know that the local wildlife, Colorado Department of Wildlife was wanting wildlife habitat, so they're paying us $100 an acre, and they're the ones that's maintaining the pollinator strip. But the interesting thing is agronomists would come to us and go, well, we're starting to see a lot of grasshopper feeding out there this year. Well, is it in our fields? No, it's in your pollinator strips. Well, let me know when it moves into the field. They saw light feeding in the field. It preferred to eat in the pollinator strip because that high sugar plant is not very palatable to them. They would rather eat on Palmer amaranth and kochia that's growing in the pollinator strip. So this row spacing is definitely challenging. Where we're headed in the future on this is we actually received a grant, and we've applied for a second grant because it's taking a little bit more money than what we anticipated. We're taking an old air seeder and we're going to 3-inch row spacing. Because I want to see what I can do with dry edible beans and cereal grains. What can I do with proso millet and oats and black-eyed peas and pinto beans on that super narrow spacing? Disease might become an issue. I doubt it in our part of the world. Yes, sir?
What are you doing to get to 12 on your bricks? Everything I tested was like 3 to 5.
The first thing number one, we are non-GMO on our farm. GMOs are a big thing all by themselves. He does a great presentation about why GMOs are an issue. We're just asking that plant to do things that Mother Nature had never intended. We don't use much for fertilizer. Our soils are very active. Our biggest challenge is residue retention, and that's one reason why I want to go to 3-inch row spacing is I'll raise a corn crop and I'll go out there in 2 years and there will be no evidence of corn stalks or cobs on the ground. I'll raise a sunflower crop 2 years, there's no stalks on the ground. Our soils are chewing through stuff like crazy. So, and because we have low moisture, we don't really shoot for really high yields. If I hit 50 bushel corn, I'm happy. I'm also raising some open pollination corn now, so I don't have to pay for corn seed in the future. It kind of changes your dynamics on that. But getting your soil health up should help drive that Brix. Foliar feeds, Russell is going to be the person to talk to on this. I mean, Russell is a manager like I have never seen in terms of micronutrient stuff. And that's some of the stuff that he is doing is driven on Brix. That we're essentially following those tenets of soil health, and the soil is responding and giving us that back. So I don't have all the answers. That's why I have friends that have answers. But I would definitely talk to Russell about that, or his presentation tomorrow, he'll probably touch on that. But we've just found we don't apply fungicides. We use minimal herbicides inside the crop. Of course, most of the stuff that we raise, there's not much herbicides we can use. So we've reduced our herbicide usage. We were down to 75%, and Palmer amaranth has been kicking our butt because I haven't been thinking about what Palmer requires. Palmer requires nice warm soils, so I need to have my herbicide out before that Palmer germinates. some issues like that. We reduce our fertilizer usage by 75%, and I think that's what it is I just have healthy, active soils for my ecosystem, and the plants are responding. The other part of it is a lot of the varieties that I use are older varieties, and I think there's been some breeding that has reduced some of that. They're pushing that racehorse out there, and like I said, at 50 bushel, I don't need triple stack traits. I'm happy with non-GMO. So I don't have an answer for you, is the best way to put it. So now I'm going to talk about other people's mistakes. We don't make mistakes, we just have happy accidents. Thank you, Bob Ross. So this happened in the last couple years. The first case was we used to raise wheat. Our farm is now gluten-free. The reason is we have a gluten-free milling company because we have made that dedication to food, because everything we raise is food. We don't raise any commodities. We might sell it at the commodity market, but we believe that it should have the same nutritional value as if we were going to eat it ourselves, because that is going to be eaten by something. It doesn't matter if it's a plant, that when you compost it back, those nutrients comes back. It doesn't matter if you're feeding it to an animal. You give really good quality corn to a cow, it's going to gain better and produce better than if it's trash. I don't know about ethanol. I assume yeast produce better ethanol if it's better corn. Oh, I don't know about that one. I do know the mushroom growers that we work with really like the quality of our grain because they grow better mushrooms on our grain. But when the last year we raised wheat, we had a neighbor whose field was just to the west of ours. He called in the wrong legals. He called in the southeast quarter instead of the southwest quarter. And they were flying on quilt, which is a common fungicide for leaf rust and wheat. And they were putting on quilt and then a micronutrient pack with a foliar nitrogen. And it took us, this is a 90-acre field, it took us about 70 acres to get figured out which plane that was and how to get a hold of him on the plane that he's in the wrong field. And we got him stopped, and where the line is in that field is where we got him stopped. So he did the south 3/4 of the field, or closer to 7/8. And I didn't notice this until about 3 days ago when I was talking with the individual from this company. But we have been, to control rust, we have been applying a foliar nitrogen with chlorine. There's a great book out there called Plant Disease and Mineral Nutrition. It's a textbook. It's the most boring book you will ever read. It's also possibly one of the most valuable books you can ever own. Because in that, you can go in there and it's 19 chapters. The first 2 chapters are talking about how nutrition affects plants. And the next 17 chapters are about all the macro and micronutrients and what diseases are present when there is a deficit and when there's abundance of those. And this research, a lot of this research goes back over 100 years. So it's super dry reading. It's a great book though, because in the index, you find the disease you have, and it'll tell you all the nutrients that are related to that disease that's been found in research. So when I looked up our leaf rust, it said chlorine. You're lacking chlorine. So there's a chemical company, Kugler, they have a really good foliar nitrogen, and they actually add chlorine to it, and they don't make it until you order it, because that chlorine will off-gas within 30 days. So we went out and we applied that, and we applied that on the rest of our fields, and we applied it on the north edge of this field. And so we had this really great experiment comparing a commercial fungicide and this other product with chlorine. And the really interesting thing that came out of it, straight out of that year, was we had the same yield, we had the same test weight. It's like, well, that's great. The wheat that we were raising there is a white wheat. The variety is snowmass, and they pay a premium for protein. For every percentage above 12, it's 80 cents a bushel. Where we applied the chlorine, we had 1% higher protein than where the commercial fungicides were applied, which is 80 cents a bushel. And even 30 bushel wheat, that's pretty good money. And so that was my initial thing. It's like, wow, fungicides have an effect. And then the other day I was talking, we work with this company, it's Downforce Technologies. I have information on our booth out there. But they're using satellites to track soil organic carbon at the down to the 12-inch level. I don't know how they do it. I think there's a little bit of magic involved. But it's really interesting because we are actually seeing different trials that we're doing in fields are showing up on these satellite images. So we were going through things and I was flipping through it and I saw this map and it's like, there's a line there. Not the line that I drew. I drew the line because it makes it a little bit easier to see because when it's projected, it doesn't come through very well. But if we look at where this line is, the darker the color, the more carbon is being fixed. And above this line, it's slightly darker on this. Well, this was the year that the wheat was grown. And that fungicide reduced the amount of carbon that was being fixed where that was applied. And it's like the next year, and as we go through, some years it really shows up. And this is 2 years out, and then it disappears again. Well, how many years does it take for fungal growth in the soil to generate? I've heard 3. Well, it happened in 21, and in 24, that effect is gone. But because the neighbor made a mistake, we were able to learn from this mistake. We could have just been pissed and called up the neighbor and said, well, you're going to pay for this and you got to fix this. Well, how do you fix something like that when everybody tells you fungicide doesn't affect the soils? I mean, then you talk to your sales guy, they're like, you can apply fungicide, it doesn't affect soil health. Well, not until you have an accidental test strip out there. And then you go, oh, wow, that makes a difference. And then you look at the dollar difference on that protein. I called up the neighbor after harvest because he called and he profusely apologized. And he said, we'll make it right. So I called him after harvest and I said, Chris, this is what I learned. And I laid it all out. And he goes, well, I'll pay you for that. And I said, no, Chris. I said, you already had to pay for the product, didn't you? And he goes, yeah, I had to pay for that product and I had to pay for the application. I said, you've already paid enough money. And you know what? That money you paid gave you the right to learn what we learned because you pretty much paid for this experiment for us. And it was interesting to see his response of what are we going to do for application now. An individual that really wasn't doing much for soil health suddenly started going, maybe I shouldn't be applying fungicide. Maybe there are other options. Here in a couple months, I'll be speaking up at Albert Lee and to a marketing group, and they're looking at growing oats, and their question to me is, how do you raise high test weight oats? And I said, first of all, you don't grow them in Colorado. But we started raising naked oats, so it's a hull-less oat, which I really think cover crop companies should look at because that's going to flow in a blend a whole lot better than a hulled oat. But these hull-less oats, they naturally have higher test weight, 42 pounds. And that's what you get out of them. Went out and harvested oats and it was 46 pounds. Had a guy on Twitter go, how did you get 46 pounds out of those oats that I've raised them before? I apply that nitrogen with chlorine fertilizer on it to control the diseases in my oats. And I think because I'm not using a fungicide, I actually can produce better test weight. But if it wasn't for the neighbor that screwed up the legals, I would have never had that opportunity to learn the effects that fungicides have on my soils. So a year ago, I was up in Denver doing deliveries. We do twice a month deliveries in Denver or Boulder of some of our products. And my mom calls me and says, there's a combine over in the 96-acre field. And I said, there's a what? She goes, do we have somebody combine in that field? And it's like, no, I'm going to start when it's dry enough because it was still too wet. And I said, you better get over there and figure out what's going on. And sure enough, custom cutter was in the wrong section. He should have been 1 mile further west. But when he was talking to the guy that he was cutting for, the guy gave him directions and he goes, oh, that's by Jeff Plum's house. And he goes, yeah, it's by Jeff Plum's house. No, it's a mile away from Jeff Plum's house. Minor detail. He ends up cutting, he's got a 40-foot draper, and he cuts about 20 acres before we get him stopped. I use a stripper header to combine grain sorghum. If they tell you it doesn't work, it's possible that it doesn't work. We just haven't had any problems with it so far. It makes a beautiful sample. There's nothing like running grain through a seed cleaner that's been harvested with a shell-borne stripper head, because there's just no trash in it. It is just no dust. It's beautiful stuff. So this happened, and my immediate thought was, what is the value of residue? When you farm in the desert, residue is king. There was a question in the last presentation, would you lose so many dollars an acre for the next 5 years? Yes, I would, if that means I have more residue. Because that residue saves moisture when you have winds that blow all the time. Jerry, you thought he was joking. Jerry has been out to our farm on the windiest days of the year this last year. And one day they were out there and the winds were 60 miles an hour. Next time you see Jerry, you should ask him how things work when solar panels become airborne because of the wind. It had 16 cinder blocks and 8 2-foot stakes holding it to the ground before the wind. Whoever tightened that flex conduit onto that thing, man, they made that thing tight, because that's the only thing that kept those solar panels in the field. But when we're in this environment that's so fragile, what is the value of that residue? So I do quite a bit of work with Colorado State University, a couple of professors there, and I immediately called Megan, and I'm like, Megan, this is what happened. And she immediately sent an email out to her other professor saying, this is what happened, somebody made a mistake, and Roy wants to know. And she immediately hopped on the internet. I called Liz. Liz said, have you asked Claude? I said, who's Claude? It's Claude.ai. It's actually designed, it's an AI designed to summarize scientific papers. So Liz asked Claude for me, what's the value of residue? It evaluated, I don't know how many papers, and it spit out, it's like $90 an acre in nutrients. But what is the value in moisture? Nobody knew. So I called Megan. Megan had found that article that Liz had forwarded me, thanks to Claude. And she says, well, it's $90 an acre. I said, yeah, but what about moisture? She goes, well, there is no research on it. I said, well, do you have a couple extra moisture probes? She goes, let me call. She calls back a little bit. She goes, I talked to Ian. Ian has some. I said, how long can I have them? Roy, you can have them as long as you want. So they came out 2 weeks later, after I had harvested, and it's difficult to see in this field. I showed it to Emily, my fiance, and she's like, well, I can't see any difference. But you look here, and on the horizon, you can see it's nice and smooth here, and on this side, it's kind of furry. If you look down here, you can see we have 8-inch residue versus stalks that are about 3 foot tall. I have a neighbor. We don't run cattle. Occasionally I have them graze. The problem is our system is so fragile that when we run cattle across it, sometimes I think it's more detrimental than it is helpful, because our residue is so important. But I had him graze this because I told him he could, and he needed the grazing, because he was using cover crops after wheat to graze, and it didn't rain. They didn't grow. Those cattle weren't very good at digging down in those furrows and eating that seed out. So I told him you can run cattle on that. So he came and he ran his mama cow's across there. And I thought any effect that that had on soil moisture has been lost because we ate off that residue. The interesting thing is we put in 2 probes. They're 20 meters apart, 10 meters into the cut side, 10 meters into the stripper-headed harvested side. What we see is even today, after we have grown a crop, there's still a difference. In that high residue side, there is more moisture. So by maintaining that residue year after year, and it's a cumulative effect because you have better crop growth where there's more moisture, so you have more residue. And it just continues on. So by looking at these mistakes, when things happen that are outside our control, we either can lose our shit, which I did initially. I'm really good at chewing people out. And then I took a step back and said, what can I learn from this and how can I learn from this? How can I take advantage of someone else's mistake? And what we found is residue is king. That stripper-headed Milo, that is beautiful stuff. I just finished harvesting before I came here because it was too wet. I got residue this tall. That is going to be great when the snow starts to blow around. We don't get a lot of snow, but when we do, it usually goes sideways. If I have residue, I keep it from going sideways. So what are we doing here in the future? The video here is an agrivoltaic system that we are testing on the farm. It is a dynamic system. It's actually tied to wind speed. When the wind hits 15 miles an hour, it folds vertical. And you can see when the clouds come over, there's a front that comes through, and it goes vertical. It's suddenly a shelter belt that's 12 feet tall. The funny thing is all the research on shelter belts have ever been done is about trees. It's not about a semi-porous dynamic solar system. So we're generating a lot of research around that. What we have found is 120 feet downwind of the shelter belt, the reduction in moisture usage in a crop is 30%. Closer is 50%. We're raising the same crop with half the moisture. The really interesting thing is when we do a nutritional analysis of that, we have 10 to 17 times higher micronutrients in those areas than in the control area. Because soil moisture is biological activity. Biological activity creates nutrition. So now, if somebody knows a tech company that would love to have an off-grid server farm, we have 10 acres that they can build a facility that's in the middle of about 2,000 acres that we can put a lot of solar production on. Because I want to farm between those rows. We're going to space them every 240 feet because it matches my equipment. So that is where we're going. We're trying to understand how we can create residue in different ways. And one way is by using agrivoltaics. Some things that usually have a really negative connotation. On our farm, we can't wait to have the opportunity to have something like this. Row spacing, we're building that new air seeder down to 3 inches. I don't know if we can hang that much iron on a toolbar. And after we put 64 openers on a 16-foot toolbar, I don't know if we have the horsepower to pull it. But we're going to find out. We got a neighbor with quad tracks if we have to. We're doing everything on variable rate now. We're zone mapping, and we're converting everything to hydraulic variable rate. So we have instant rate change. And with our air seeder that has 3 or 4 bins, depending upon which one we're running, we're looking actually shutting off a crop to turn on a cover crop blend because we have some areas in the fields that are really poor, really, really poor. It's not even worth putting a crop out there. So why can't I put a cover crop out there while I'm drilling my regular crop? Save my seed cost and put it in something that's going to improve the soil. The crop insurance companies hate that because they got to figure out what that area is. We're doing the stuff with the mapping. What we've learned from downforce has been so interesting. We're actually looking at what crops actually fix carbon, what crops reduce carbon. And now we're finding different varieties that have more carbon than other varieties. So a really interesting information that we're getting back from that. Like I said, we've put in 140 acres of pollinator strips. We're already starting to see some effects, but the really big thing is that's where I'm going to turn my equipment so I don't have to worry about my compaction so much. And just all kinds of different crazy stuff. We have a booth out there that'll be hanging out. We're actually working on creating an online community to help farmers develop soil health practices and more crops and markets. So if you have any questions, we're probably out of time.
You deserve at least a couple of questions. So that was one. If anyone has them, let's take a couple, and then I can, beg forgiveness for the next speaker. I already see someone in the back.
Well,
You got one up here? Go ahead.
On your sorghum residue, I kind of got lost. You didn't take any residue off. You just cut it with a different header. But you still. I guess I'm not connecting the dots as to why you're seeing is it just snow catching the winter?
And it's also the reduction of wind speed, because that wind, as it blows across there, it sucks the moisture out. The question is with the difference in the two sorghum where one is cut and the other one was a stripper head, the residue remained because it passed through the combine. We didn't bale it or anything. So why are we seeing a difference in moisture? And it's that reduction of wind speed. It's also capturing more snow. What we had never realized, it first came evident in the agrivoltaic system, we had 2 inches of rain in April. And I talk about our wind, you don't really appreciate it until you see it. We had 2 inches of rain in April, and the following 2 days, the wind blew on average 60 miles an hour with gusts over 90 for 2 days. In the soil moisture probes, where it was protected by the agrivoltaic system, you saw the moisture go to the 6-inch level, to the 12-inch level, to the 18-inch level. Where there was no wind protection, the moisture made it to the 6-inch level and never made it to the 12-inch level. We evaporated the moisture out of the ground that quickly. So that difference in coverage is vital to us.
Let's grab one more.
How are you combining the 12-inch corn?
How am I combining 12-inch corn? I guarantee you I'm not buying a 12-inch corn head. I priced one of those. I didn't pay that much for my combine. We're using the pan head out of our sunflowers. It's a 9-inch pan. The advantage is we can cut our corn whatever direction we want. So if we do have some terracing, we have some hilly fields, not quite what you guys have around here, but I can actually cut around the field or along the terrace or along the contour if I need to. I lose some low ears. I was originally using Stein's short stature corn. The problem is those ears were just too low for me to get. I liked what I was seeing with the plant, but I couldn't harvest it. So I'm going to taller corns. That's the advantage of doing an open pollination corn, is some of those are quite a bit taller. I dropped some ears. I'm willing to do that because of the difference I get in residue. I also am passing a lot of residue through the combine when you're cutting it off at knee high. I have a buddy who likes to think about these things. He said, Roy, you're going to start throwing corn over at 122 bushel an acre. And I looked at him and said, I'll throw 5 bushel over at 122 bushel an acre. I'm fine with that. If I make 122 bushel corn, that is like super win for me. So, but yeah, that is the one challenge, is how to harvest.